This is every generation of MacBook Air. The MacBook Air has been around for 14 years now, and over that impressive lifespan, it went from blazing a trail for thin and light laptops during the Intel transition to now blazing a trail for fanless thin and light laptops in the Apple Silicon transition. And while there have certainly been some bumps along the way, the MacBook Air is the best-selling laptop of all time. And today, we're going to talk about its history and how we got here. So make sure to leave a like down below and subscribe, and let's get into it. It all starts back in 2008 with Steve Jobs unveiling the original unibody MacBook Air. Now, I say unibody, and that's a term that we typically associate with the MacBook Pro, but one of the things that made the MacBook Air possible was that it actually introduced the unibody design language. And so with that in mind, during the development of the original MacBook Air, they were able to accomplish something radical. The first Ultrabook, essentially. Steve Jobs famously quoted,
"The thickest part of the MacBook Air is still thinner than the thinnest part of the TZ series."
But the MacBook Air didn't just give us the unibody. It also gave us the look that modern MacBooks have. That black keyboard, this was the first time that made an appearance, and it has stuck around ever since. Similarly, and perhaps more importantly, multi-touch gestures made their debut on this MacBook Air. Even though it does have a separate click button, which would be phased out starting later the same year it was introduced, the surface is much larger and features recognition for multiple touch points, which allowed for the gesture control that has made macOS iconic over the past 14 years. And with all of these innovations, who could forget the iconic manila envelope ad from when the MacBook Air came out? On paper then, it was a revolution. It was unlike anything that any manufacturer had ever made before, and that immediately set it apart. However, there was a reason why no one had made a laptop like this before, and that is, well, physics. See, in order to get the MacBook Air that thin, Apple had to make a lot of sacrifices. The first was on the size of the battery. That obviously had to shrink dramatically, and because they hadn't invented those fancy terraced battery cells yet, you ended up with quite a bit of empty space. The second thing that had to shrink was the CPU itself. Apple was making a logic board that was only as long as a pencil, and so it needed to shrink the package size for Intel's CPUs, but they kept a fairly normal Intel CPU. And that proved to be a bit of a problem, because the original MacBook Air's cooling system is, with the best word in the world, garbage. It sucks. It's basically a piece of tinfoil glued on top of the Intel CPU with a crappy little fan that spins vaguely near it. And as a result of that, the original MacBook Air throttled so much, to the point where if you started doing, web browsing, word processing, it would get so hot that that Intel CPU would disable one of its two cores. So it was a Core 2 Duo technically, but anytime you needed that second core, it was off because it was so hot. So it wasn't exactly known for being very fast. It also had a hard drive that was pulled directly from the iPod.
We've shipped tens of millions of these in iPods. We know them well.
It's 4,200 RPM. It's absolutely tiny. It's kind of cute, I'm not gonna lie. And it is not even remotely acceptable, even 14 years ago, for use with a full desktop operating system. But it's okay, because Apple allowed you to upgrade to an SSD for the low, low price of $1,000.
These are a little pricey, but they are fast.
For an SSD, oh my god. And this thing was not cheap either. It started at $17.99 in 2008. It was a technical accomplishment to build a computer that looked like this, but it was also a very bad computer that not a lot of people really liked. And so it did get updated, right? They gave it more modern CPUs that didn't throttle, and they gave it the integrated graphics from the MacBook Pro, the NVIDIA GeForce 9400M, and they made the SSD not $1,000, which is great. But it was definitely a first-gen product. And so when this guy came out in 2010, things changed dramatically. But before we get to that, a quick word from today's video sponsor. Soundcore just launched their brand new Space A40 noise-canceling earbuds and Q45 headphones with impressive battery life and an affordable price point. Both offer up to 98% noise reduction through active noise cancellation, which seeks out common sounds like airplane engine or tire noise or even babies crying. And you can control all of this through the Soundcore app, which lets you switch between active noise cancellation, normal mode, and transparency. Here you can also adjust sound profiles depending on the type of music that you're listening to, and configure the input buttons. At $99 and $149 respectively, the A40 and Q45 represent astonishing value and sound quality, as well as being packed with features. Tap, double tap, and long press on the capacitive touchpads on the earbuds to activate programmable gestures that you can assign through the app. And the Q45s feature volume control and play pause easily on the headset, as well as a programmable noise cancellation button. The high-quality construction includes supple ear cups, aluminum alloy hinges for maximum strength, and a seamless sliding adjustable headband with padding that makes the Q45 comfortable for long periods of time. Both offer an incredible 50 hours of playback, which is really impressive for the price point. They both have extremely good sound quality. I have to say the bass on the A40s is extremely punchy, and the treble and the mid-range on the Q45s is really, really crisp. Both are punching well above their weight class given the price point. If you want to learn more about the A40 and Q45s from Soundcore, check out the link in the description below. These things are really, really good. And now, let's get back to some MacBook Airs.
But there is one more thing.
The second generation MacBook Air was a really, really big deal for Apple. For one, it had a much better design. We lost that little trap door with the 3 ports that nobody ever really liked, and instead we got very normal, traditional, and bountiful side ports. The design was frankly an instant classic, and for 2010 and 2011, the MacBook Air was actually a better buy than the MacBook Pro because they upped the screen resolution to 1440 by 900, which was better than the 13-inch MacBook Pro. It also came with SSD storage as standard versus spinning drives in the MacBook Pro, and it was $100 cheaper. It was a win-win situation. But the biggest thing about this generation MacBook Air was what it meant for the future, because Apple was aware that they were creating an ecosystem. And so Steve Jobs wanted to combine everything that the Mac, iPhone, and iPad could offer.
Being inspired by that, bringing some of that back to Mac OS X. What would happen if a MacBook met an iPad?
Looking back on it, this moment from nearly 12 years ago really sets the stage for what would eventually become the Apple Silicon Mac. The benefits are undeniable: instant on, great battery life, efficient processors, all flash, and a focus on mobility. These are Apple Silicon traits. So with Apple Silicon nicely teed up, the second generation of MacBook Air was set for success. And to make it even better, Apple introduced a new, smaller version to fill a lower price point.
In addition to the 13.3-inch, its younger brother is an 11.6-inch.
Now, the 11-inch MacBook Air may never have reached the same level of popularity as the 13-inch, mainly because of its cramped keyboard and screen, but it did get the MacBook Air down to $999 for the first time. However, that was short-lived. Just 2 years later, Apple quietly updated the MacBook Air to feature newer MagSafe 2 connection while retaining the same general design, but the bigger update came in 2013 with the arrival of NVMe storage. And more importantly, it got Intel's Haswell U-series processors, which were specifically designed for thin and light laptops. And so they were a lot more efficient, had a lot better battery life, and were more powerful. It got another spec bump in 2015, moving down to $999 for the 13-inch and $899 for the 11, and then in 2017, they just killed off the 11-inch and spec bumped the 13. But by then, there was a problem. See, by 2017, this design was already 7 years old. And sure, they gave it a new upgraded processor that was like 1% better than the other processor. But my goodness, it needed an update. The rest of the MacBooks were getting the new design language, but this one still had these absolutely chunky silver bezels, and honestly, it was getting a little bit stale. So then in 2018, Apple replaced it with this, and it was not good. So it was not only more expensive than the outgoing model, coming in at $1199, but it didn't really have that much of an upgrade. The 8th generation Core i5 that powered it was really slow, just like the one before it, and it had the same starting storage of 128 gigabytes, which wasn't really acceptable in 2018. And that's before we even get into the whole, how do we say, butterfly keyboard of the whole thing. Yeah, this generation wasn't super popular because it was just so similar to the 13-inch MacBook Pro. And that was $100 more, much more powerful, and it had better battery life. So it was definitely a bit perplexing why Apple chose to make the MacBook Air basically just a carbon copy of the MacBook Pro. And guess what, folks? It wasn't even any thinner. What we found was just a slightly wedge-shaped 13-inch MacBook Pro with a pretty weak processor and a fan that isn't actually connected to the heatsink. That's right, folks. They went back to the same cooling system as was in the original MacBook Air. It's just a little heatsink and then a fan that just blows air around near it, but not directly across it. There's no fin stack or anything. Yeah, it's kind of bad. And while that did get updated in 2019, they added True Tone to the display, woohoo. And then again in 2020, where they fixed the butterfly keyboard, brought the price back down to $999, and gave it a slightly less anemic processor. The really exciting thing that got all of us talking was Apple Silicon. That, in my opinion, is when the MacBook Air came into its own. You look back over this entire history, and there were only a few years here and there where the MacBook Air was hands down the best value. You can look back at 2010, you can look at 2013 or 2014, but it wasn't until Apple Silicon that it became the absolute best of the best. What Apple Silicon did was it proved that the MacBook Air didn't have to be limited. And the new M2 MacBook Air continues that tradition. We have an updated design, finally. It's been, again, about 4 years since the previous 2018 design generation came out. And well, Apple definitely didn't take a lot of risks with this new generation. There's no terraced battery cells, there's no insanely compact logic board. It's a pretty standard design on the inside. They definitely built a product that lives up to its expectation. It's the thin, light, entry-level MacBook, and it does a very good job at that. It punches way above its weight class in terms of performance, especially considering that it doesn't have a fan. And while it does have some compromises, thermal throttling if you really try to push it, as well as the rather unfortunately slow base model's SSD, I think Apple is back on their game with this new generation. So I'm curious to know what you guys think. What point along the way was the MacBook Air at its best? Was it the quirky and radical, if limited, first model? Was it the absolute bestseller second edition? Was it the flawed but I don't really have a defense for the third model with the Intel. It was just kind of bad. Or is it best now with Apple Silicon? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm super curious to hear what you guys think. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.